Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insights at DDLynn Designs. This is DDLynn, and I am really excited to share tips, tricks, and super cool techniques to accelerate all of our journeys in the ancient art of wire. So today, before we get started, I want to talk about what we're going to be making. So we're going to be doing what I call a bridge weave, which very much looks like a little bit of the sumac, but it's not, because it's all based on what wires we're weaving through, and we'll get to that in a minute. So we'll be doing a full tutorial that I may do in 2 parts, depending on how long this first part takes, because it's going to be a bracelet. And most importantly, even though this tutorial is more for an intermediate to advanced wire artist, I specifically will always be very detail oriented for beginners and newbies, because I remember when I started out, the little fine, tiny details that were lacking so much, I realized how much that will help us as we're starting out in this magical ancient art of wire. So let's get started. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how to measure your wrist bracelet length. So today I'm going to be using 6 18-gauge square dead soft wires, and I'm also going to use a 26-gauge weaving wire, and I'm also using a ring clamp. And if you notice down here, I've already weaved what I call an in and out, where you go over a wire, then between a wire, over a wire, and in between a wire. And the reason why I did that before we start the actual weave pattern itself is because I wanted to get my wires trained based on knowing the gauge of weaving wire I'm using in between them. And in order to do that, I set my wires up by just creating a basic in and out pattern where it's separating them perfectly, or almost like a figure 8, but going over a wire, going completely around the wire, then in between it, completely around the wire, and then in between it, creates the perfect gap for the width that I will need in between each of these wires for this 26 gauge. So for those of you that are working with a 28 gauge, which by all means do so, I just prefer a thicker gauge when I'm making bracelets. Anything that's subject to a lot of movement coming on and off the wrist, I tend to go with thicker gauges of wire. I'm not using a 16 gauge in this particular bracelet for 2 reasons. One, I'm using 6 wires, which gives it a lot more durability and strength. And most importantly is this weave. This is a super tight knit weave. So it's really going to keep the wires really strongly knitted together, versus if you were doing a pyramid pattern or a very loose figure 8 weave, these wires would be more susceptible to bend. But this particular weave pattern is known for creating a lot of strength and durability when we're using it for rings or bracelets, anything that's going to create a lot of wear and tear. Again, because the weaving is so tightly knitted together. So we'll go through that in just a little bit, but I wanted to go over all the details and the basics of what we're going to be doing here. So I'm going to be setting my wires aside. I highly recommend you use a ring clamp, and I can tell you it's a bit fiddly when you're trying to put this many wires into a ring clamp and line them up accurately. So one of the tools that I use, and you can use a pocket knife to do this. These are lots of tips and tricks, gang, to really help you out when you're trying to figure all this out. Because when I first got my first ring clamp, when I first started doing wire 2 years ago, I just couldn't use it. It was just over my head and out of my reach. And it took time and practice. So be really patient with yourself. But I use this to separate my wires. So I know that I need 26 gauge. And I also use this as I'm coming back in and getting further out with my weave pattern to make sure that I start pulling my wires in, because I want to keep them lined up. But for right now, we're really good. So little tips and tricks: find a pocket knife to create the right gauge that you want, or weave your wire back and forth, over each wire individually and in between each wire to create the gap that you need before you starting your pattern. Okay, so just a couple tips there. So let's get started on how to measure our wire length for our wrist. So I've already measured, I have a piece of string here, and I know that my wrist loosely, and not super loose, is approximately a little shy of 6.5 inches. So it's going to be kind of hard for me to show you this on my wrist, which is why I have that little piece of scrap wire down there. But basically what you're going to do is take a piece of string, and the reason why I use string is it's more accurate. You're going to wrap it around your wrist, and then you're going to cut it dead center in the middle of where and how you want that bracelet to set on your wrist. I like my bracelets a little snug, so I cut this exactly a little bit loosely, not a lot, the width of my wrist, which is 6.5 inches. And then I took myself some scrap wire that was all twisted together, and I wrapped it around my wrist to see how it's going to fit. Now, keeping in mind that I have 6 wires, so that's going to create a different girth. Now, how we know where to start down from the wire, meaning where are we going to start our weaving? If you noticed here, I made a mark back. If these wires were straight, like what's in my ring clamp, okay, I went back on these wires here just a little over 1/2 inch, because you need to have loose wire on the end of where you're starting your weave, because you're going to need to make your loops at that end or a decorative design to put in your hook and clasp on each side. And I know by getting my scrap wire like this and turning it into a little bracelet, and then I put it around my wrist, it gives me an idea of my gap. So if this is 6.5 inches of wire, and I'm going to fold it back 1/2 inch on each side, that means that I've lost 1 inch of that wire in total, okay? So if I just bent these back right now, and I'm sure there's an easier way to think about this. This is just the way I'm thinking about it. You do whatever works for you. But when you're measuring, the rule of thumb in bracelets is that always, if you want your bracelet longer after you measure your wrist, and my wrist is 6.5 inches, then measure your wire 7 inches, because you're going to be taking off that length. I'm actually staying pretty true to my wrist size, because I know I'm going to be rolling these back into loops and cutting them either 3 or 2 centimeters, as well as I need room for my clasp. And do you see that now? I have about 1.25 inch distance there. So I'm going to be putting in about a 1/2 inch clasp and a little greater than a 1/2 inch hook. And I want some spring back. So it'll all make sense as it's coming together. I just wanted to give you some visuals of how to measure your wire. So let's go ahead and get started, and then we'll talk about the lengths that we're going to need. Now, I'm going to need to ask you to be a little patient with me, because these wires are really long, and I am working underneath this little camera. So this is about I think my 6th video inside of a little bit over a month. So here we go. We're going to start the bridge weave. And the reason why I call it that is, in all honesty, I saw someone do a bracelet, not a tutorial, post a bracelet online. This was about a year ago. And I loved the weave. And I emailed or texted them, and I asked them what kind of weave pattern that was and if they did a tutorial. And they said no, but they said it was called the bridge weave. So I stuck with that. I took a picture of the pattern and I studied it for quite some time until I figured it out, because a year ago I had to stare at things a long time. So let's go ahead and get started. So presuming that you've already lined up your wires and you have your starting first wire pattern so that you're setting yourself up to know what distance you need between the wires to wrap the gauge of wire that you're using through. So again, I'm starting with 26 gauge. I'm going to be working off the spool. And I'm going to do my dangdest to stay in frame because of the length of these wires. I'm going to be using my chain nose to cinch back as I go. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap over the base wire, wire 1. So we have 6 wires. I'm going to refer to them wires 1 through 6. And again, for advanced and intermediate artists, watch me go through these first several patterns, and then you can fast forward through, waiting until I teach the closure for the class. So for beginners, we're going to wrap around our first wire, which is wire 1. Okay. Then we're going to wrap around wires 1 and 2. And I'm having to move this wire out of the way to run it through. Now I am behind wires 1 and 2, and I'm going to come up between wires 1 and 2. And I'm going to pull that wire snug. And another great thing about a ring clamp is it allows you to really pull your wires in. Now I'm going to go up and over wires 2, 3, and 4. And notice how my wire is opening up there a little bit. And that's because 1, I'm pulling, not pushing as much. And 2, obviously I need a little bit more of a gap. So now that I'm over wires 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to come underneath, I'm staying underneath, and I'm going to come between wires 2 and 3. Then I'm going to go back up over wires 3, 4, and 5. It's going to take a little brain work here because it can get a little confusing. And I'm going to push my wire back because of the way that I'm doing this so that you can see it. You're going to see me do some awkward things with my fingers. Now, this is what you should have. Now I'm going to come in between wires 4 and 5. And I'm going to go over wire 6. 1 full rotation. I'm going to go over wires 5 and 6 twice. I'm sorry, you guys. I'm going over wires 5 and 6 one time, then back in between wires 5 and 6, and over wire 6. And I'm going to cinch, and this is what we should have. Our first pattern or set. So now we're going to repeat this, but I want to complete this set. So I'm coming around the back because remember, I just went over wire 6, and now I'm going to go over wire 1 again, and I've complete 1 set or 1 pattern. And then because I don't want my wires spreading out a lot, I'm going to constantly be adjusting them in. And see how I'm just using my fingernail to make sure they're lined up. And sometimes I'll come in with that fun little, this is a wood carving tool, pocket knife works just fine. And I'll start lining my wires up because I don't want them going out in a V shape. So this is the tricky part, is making sure, because they're naturally going to want to do that, that you keep them lined up as you go. So just be mindful, watch what you're doing as you go. We're pretty good down here for about a good inch, but I still pay attention to that because they naturally want to spread out. So now we're going to do our second repeat or pattern. So basically we're repeating the same exact pattern, and we're going to go up and over wires 1 and 2 because we already went around wire 1. Then I'm coming in between wire 1 and 2. I'm going over wires 3, 4, and 5. I'm coming in between wires 2 and 3, coming up and over wires 3, 4, and 5, coming in between wires 4 and 5, over wires 5 and 6, and this is what I mean by when you have long wires like this and you're working under a camera, you can bend them out of shape. So I'm being super mindful right now. So I just went over wires 4 and 5. I'm coming in between wires 4 and 5, going over wire 6, and I'm going to cinch that up, and I'm going to complete this repeat or pattern or set by going over wire 1. And now we have 2 repeats or 2 sets. Okay, so this is what we're going to keep doing. I'm going to repeat what I'm doing a couple of more times, and then I'm just going to keep doing it for a while, and it's probably going to get really boring for advanced artists, and then I may just stop this video and complete the entire bracelet until I get to a 1/2 inch from my bottom wires, and then I'll start the video again and add it on for the next week. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this pattern again, because you got to get this in your head, because we have a lot of habits of wanting to go back in between the same wires that we went over on our basic weaves. So now I'm going to go over wires, and they're losing some shape because of me banging them around. 1 and 2, in between wires 1 and 2, over wires 3, if I can get my wire out of there, 3, 4, and 5, in between wires 3 and, oops, wrong. See what I mean? That's a habit for me too. In between wires 2 and 3. That's what makes this such a cool pattern. Over wires 3, 4, and 5. Now I'm going to go back in between wires 4 and 5. Then I'm going over wires 5 and 6. And I'm in the back. I'm going to come in between wires 5 and 6. And now I'm going to go over wire 1. And just so you can see what's going on in the back, as I'm going over, over wire 6, as I'm going over wire 6, I'm in the back. I'm just continuing all the way down the back of all those wires and completing my pattern over the base wire 1. And now we have what's called 3 continuous patterns or 3 repeats of the same pattern. Okay, here we go. So I am going to go over wires 1 and 2 for you beginners. In between wires 1 and 2. Over wires, because I'm in between wires 1 and 2, over wires 2, 3, and 4. Okay? So I've now gone over wires 2, 3, and 4. 2, 3, and 4. I'm coming in between wires 2 and 3. coming back over wires 4, 5, and I'm sorry, 3, 4, and 5. It gets confusing for me to tell these, calling these wires numbers for your sake, everybody, when normally I'm not doing that in my head. So anyways, we're going to go back over wires. We came in between wires 2 and 3, so we're up above here. We're going to go back over wires 3, 4, and 5. Oops, I missed it. And that's because my wires are so dang long. I'm hitting my camera and bending them out of shape. Now I'm going to come in between wires 4 and 5. I'm going to go over wires 5 and 6. I'm going to come back in between wires 5 and 6. And I'm going to roll around the back. So this wire is coming straight down the back. And I'm going to repeat my pattern and complete it. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 repeats, or we've repeated the pattern 4 times. So I'm going to do this a couple more times, and then I'm going to finish it off camera and then do a second video because I don't have fancy software of knowing how to attach videos to each other. Not there yet. And I'll post that after I complete this one. Okay? Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Let me just do a couple of more patterns for the beginners because I'm sure the advanced students have this down already. And I'm going to start being very mindful about where my wires are nesting and how they're nesting against each other because I really like neat. So here we go, and I'm going to try to do this without banging my wires into everything. I need an overhead camera. That's what I need. Anybody want to donate one to me? Let me know. Okay, so here we go. We're going over wires. 1 and 2. Okay, there went my camera, which I was afraid that was going to happen. So y'all just going to have to bear with me. I'm going to come in between wires 1 and 2. Now I'm going to go over wires 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to come in between wires 2 and 3. I'm going to go over 3 wires again, which is 3, 4, and 5. This time I'm going to come in between wires 4 and 5. Then I'm going to go over wires 5 and 6. I'm going to come in between wires 5 and 6. I'm going to rotate my wires. I'm actually going to cinch that because I want it nice and snug. And I'm going to swing this wire as I'm pressing it against the back, all the way around the back to the base wire number 1. And I am going to complete that pattern. So I have done 5 repeats. And now you can see why this can get really boring watching this forever. There are artists out there that will go all the way through, but I don't have the right setup, everybody, to keep banging my wires, which is going to change the shape of this beautiful bracelet. So I'm going to do a couple more and then I'll close for now. And there you have it. So just remember to cinch down. Make sure you haven't crossed over any of your wires, beginners. And I just felt something on the back here. So this is a perfect example. I crossed over just a little bit. So all I'm going to do is fold her over that wire. Just crossed her over a little bit. You always want to check for that. And I'll post this and then stay tuned for the second part of this tutorial. For this will be finished a ½ inch away from the base of these wires, and then we'll be making our loops, closing off our weaving, and attaching our clasp. Thanks for watching, everybody. Remember to be kind and have a wonderful, magical, fabulous day. Bye for now.